The Pat Campbell Show podcast, presented by Oklahoma Men's Clinic, where you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Guaranteed. Call 918-280-8336 for Oklahoma Men's Clinic.
We are joined by Daniel Horowitz. Now, Daniel is with Eric Erickson's Red State. He's also with the Madison Project. And I asked him to come on the program this morning and talk with us a little bit about James Lankford, Congressman James Lankford, who is the only formally announced candidate for Senator Tom Coburn's seat. And with that said, Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, Pat.
Daniel, in fact, I tweeted this. I believe that Oklahoma is about to become ground zero for an epic battle. And that battle is for the struggle of the soul, the destiny of the Republican Party. And I see it shaping up that way between Lankford and Jim Bridenstine, should Jim Bridenstine enter. I believe that Lankford has been handpicked by the powers that be, the Boehners, the Mitch McConnells, and that they will see to it that he's properly funded. And you've got some problems with James Lankford. Tell me about it.
Sure, absolutely. Well, you're definitely correct that Oklahoma is about to become the most immediate battleground for this civil war that's really playing out across the country on an unprecedented level. Just the sheer number of races, the degree of challenges. We have a challenge against Mitch McConnell, the leader himself, in Kentucky. This is the year where voters are really going to decide the direction of the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And that's all coming to Oklahoma now. And, you know, I would love to talk about Jim, and he really needs to get in. But obviously, James Lankford is the only announced candidate so far.
Right.
And look, I believe he's a nice guy. He came out of nowhere, kind of like a Mr. Smith goes to Washington type of deal. But in short order, after only about 2 years, he got into leadership, and he's become a reliable vote for leadership. Once in a while, when they feel he needs to look over his shoulder at those really rabble-rousing conservatives in Oklahoma, throw them some bones. But in general, it is very clear he will never change the status quo.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. You mentioned that he's in the ranks of leadership after just 2 short years. You don't get there by fighting the status quo, do you?
Absolutely not. If there is anyone who is a threat to, the K Street complex, the donor class, the consultant class, someone who wants to overturn Washington, they will never make it to leadership. They won't even get a committee chairmanship. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that doesn't speak of him personally. He's a nice guy, and I think privately in his life, I'm sure he is probably generally pretty conservative. Yeah. But most people are. The problem is, how do you find someone who shares those heartland values, is able to actually win, then goes to Washington and doesn't flinch and changes Washington instead of being changed by it? Jim appears to be one of those rare gems who has actually done everything we asked of him and plus more. Mm-hmm. And yes, he's only been there a short while. All things equal, if we can, wave a magical wand and have an open seat after another 3-4 years would be great. But we don't have that luxury. And, many of us feel he needs to get in. This is his time.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about Bridenstine.
Bridenstine.
Yeah, Jim Bridenstine. One of the things that I've been bringing up on the program, and I want to bring my co-host in too, Eddie Huff, on this. There's one other name that hasn't been ruled out yet, and that's T.W. Shannon, who's the Speaker of the House. If he gets into this race, he could be a game changer, especially if Bridenstine does too, because Bridenstine and Shannon could wind up splitting votes and seeing to it that Lankford gets in. But one of the things I've been harping on the radio is that in this field of candidates, there's only 2 that are beltway tested, specifically Lankford and Bridenstine. T.W. Shannon's a great guy, but I have no idea how he will behave if he gets into the U.S. Senate. I know exactly how Lankford's going to behave. I know exactly how Bridenstine will behave. In fact, Bridenstine's very first action was to stand up to the leadership and vote against John Boehner. Can you convince my co-host, Eddie, why beltway tested is so important?
Pat, you just hit it on the nail. I could say humbly, it's just the average Joe who got involved on behalf of the grassroots. There's few people that kind of see both camps from where I sit, both the legislative side and the electoral side. I write for Red State, follow every legislative battle, but I help run a PAC Madison project where we look in the Republican primaries to find these kind of citizen legislator types who could win. And I could tell you, I've interviewed dozens of candidates this cycle. Here's the problem. Everyone sounds like Barry Goldwater in the primary. You interview people intellectually in the abstract about free markets, limited government. They're all with you. And, frankly, a lot of them are. They're not frauds. But when you get to Washington, it is so difficult to fight that status quo. It is not just the Democrats. As you see, the GOP leadership, they're pushing amnesty now instead of fighting Obamacare. That's how off the rails they are. That is, that's who's pulling their strings. The K Street, bundlers that are pushing them into basically supporting a permanent Democrat majority on issues like amnesty, giving up on Obamacare, permanent debt ceiling increases. You have to basically go in there with the mindset that you will have zero friends, you will not get a penny from them, and it's 1 out of 100 someone who could actually stand up to that. It is 1 out of 1,000 someone who shares those values, is able to be savvy enough to actually defeat an incumbent like Jim did and get in there as their first act, vote against your leadership, and never turn back from there. I don't know much about TW. I'm not from Oklahoma, and I can't speak to his voting record, but it is very hard to imagine that we'll have someone who is that proven as Jim. And I would add one more point.
Right.
The Senate is even worse than the House. The Senate GOP leadership, in general, the Senate Republicans are always more liberal. It is a cesspool. If you are not ironclad, you will become part of the problem. And after a few years, you'll see that. You see even with someone like Coburn.
Coburn changed.
He was the original Tea Party. I
Yeah.
mean, he was. But that's the thing. It is so difficult. And a guy like Langford, probably the first year or two, maybe he'll be somewhat decent. They drift. And Jim is that rare candidate. I have not seen that anywhere.
Daniel, let me. I want
to
to go through some of the votes because you wrote about this yesterday. Bring up some of the votes that Langford has cast that lead you to question his conservative credentials.
The fundamental battles of our time will be Obamacare, and the rising debt. And on those fronts, we very clearly have several points of leverage. We have debt ceilings and we have budget bills. Even if we win back the Senate next year, we will still not have the presidency. Obama will be president until 2017. By then, Obamacare will be immutable. There is no way to repeal it. Just so many people will be dependent on it of no fault of their own. And we cannot wait until then to repeal Obamacare. James Langford, along with the rest of leadership, has made it clear that they will rubber stamp all those budget bills and the debt ceiling increases, just like the Chamber of Commerce has requested of them. Therefore, we have, what's the purpose of going into the Senate? We're not going to stop that control debt. We're not going to stop Obamacare. But I'll tell you what the purpose is. There is one thing Republicans can do when they take back the Senate, and that is help Obama secure a second-term legacy of passing amnesty. That is exactly what they would do. That's exactly what they said they're going to do. And the question is James Langford going to be a guy standing up, not just voting, but giving voice to the grassroots and saying, stop. This is not something we're going to do when Obama's president. We're going to demand you secure the borders first. No. He's equivocated on the issue. He's expressed support for amnesty. He's certainly not someone who's going to stand up against it. And again, if he's the best we have, so be it. Mm-hmm. But when you have a guy like Jim in the delegation, gosh, he's got to run.
Mm-hmm. If we get Langford as our next senator, and he's relatively young, I think he's 45 years old, we could wind up having him for the next 20, 30 years. Am I overstating things by saying that he would be the equivalent of a Mitch McConnell or a Lindsey Graham or a John Boehner?
Absolutely. I wouldn't necessarily say Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham just relishes in scoring points for the other team.
Yeah.
He's kind of a class of his own. But just a typical establishment Republican, what we would say is a status quo type.
Right.
Someone personally, he's not a liberal, but he will not change. He will not do what it takes to change that power structure. He will not be an equal and opposing force to the likes of Schumer and Reid that we need from a Bridenstine and a Cruz.
Again, we're talking with Daniel Horowitz. If people want to read more about what you've written about Langford, where do we send them?
Sure. You can look at towards the top of redstate.com. We go through some of his recent votes and some of the games he's played with changing his votes.
Right.
Mid-budget battle. And you can also go to MadisonProject.com where we're vetting candidates, and we're looking very closely at a lot of races. We're engaged in a lot of races, and this is a race that's a top priority for us if Jim gets in.
Yeah, Daniel, we're going to be talking a lot more in the weeks and months